It's very exciting to see the work of our students and professors. We're very proud of you, and maybe this be encouragement for everyone. There's a lot we can do. So we'll move on to our speech with Professor Michael Lindsay. He is with us virtually, and I'm going to give you a brief introduction of a special speaker. Michael Lindsay is an American sociologist, and he's the president of Taylor University. He was also the president of Gordon College, a private liberal arts Christian evangelical school in the North Coast of Boston from 2011 to 2021. He graduated from Baylor University. In the year 2000, he graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary. He got his postgrad degree in Oxford in 2001. He got his PhD from Princeton in 2006. So here I'm going to move. I'm sure your speech is going to be very inspiring for us. I'd like to remind all of us watching that you can send your questions through the QR code that is on the screen, and they will go straight to our speaker. And now I pass the floor and the broadcast to you over at Taylor.
Good morning. My name is Laura Edwards. I am from São Paulo, capital, and it is my privilege to teach psychology here at Taylor University. Dr. Lindsay serves as the president of Taylor University, and in addition to being an accomplished author and having impressive credentials as a sociologist, he is also husband to Rebecca for more than 25 years and a devoted father to Elizabeth, Caroline, and Emily. Dr. Lindsay holds a special place in his heart for Mackenzie and the Mackenzistas, and it is a privilege for us to have him share with us this morning. Would you help me in welcoming Dr. Michael Lindsay?
Good morning. Good morning and welcome. We are so excited to greet our friends in Brazil. I just wanted to have an opportunity for you to see these amazing Taylor students who are here. We got up early this morning to be able to greet you. Taylor folks, let's say hello to folks in Brazil. We are blessed with a wonderful relationship with Mackenzie and excited about this history-making day for us to do a broadcast here in the U.S. and in Brazil. I spent 10 years of my life interviewing some of the most prominent leaders in different walks of life and wrote a book about the way in which they navigate change and transition. It's called Hinge Moments. The particular project was a wonderful study in looking at leadership, entrepreneurial leadership that serves the common good and how we might be able to develop that. And in the course of developing that leadership project, I had an opportunity to meet an amazing array of individuals, including former presidents of the United States that I had a chance to interview, the CEO of large companies like Ford and General Motors, as well as Walmart. I also had the chance to interview the presidents of Harvard, Stanford, and Princeton. All of them talked about the role in which they made strategic moves, strategic decisions that would allow them to navigate change that happened in their life. Change is one of those things that happens to us instantly, in a moment. Transition, however, is something that happens over weeks or months or years. Navigating change and transition can be some of the most important things that we do in our life. And particularly for us university students, thinking about how you navigate that with godly desire in a way that honors the Lord, it requires a lot of wisdom and discernment. So part of what we hope to do at institutions like Taylor and Mackenzie is help cultivate that sense of wisdom and discernment, where we can learn from great people who have been faithful and navigated those changes and transitions in their life with distinction and with integrity. So how is it that we think about these inflection points, these hinge moments that occur in our life? If you're like the average person in either Brazil or the United States, we're going to be given somewhere between 70 and 80 million minutes to make a difference in our life. But in the end, it will be probably 1 or 2 dozen of those minutes that disproportionately shape the rest of our lives. They shape the trajectory of who we become. And so we want to think about practical lessons that we can learn. The first is the importance of demonstrating creativity. This is Kevin Plank. He's a very unassuming and surprising CEO. Kevin was never a very good student. In fact, when he studied at the University of Maryland, he never really made above a C. Typically, he barely got by on his academic achievements. He also was a football player, but he was never going to be the starting player. Many of his teammates were drafted to play for NFL teams, but that was never going to be Kevin's future. Instead, he realized that he had to draw upon his unique skills and abilities and in one way or another, try to leverage those to make a positive difference. He faced a choice, as all of us do while he was approaching graduation, trying to think about how would he spend his days and what would be his future. For some of us, we pursue a career trajectory starting at high school age, and eventually it carries us through university. We know exactly what we want to do, but most people figure it out as they go along. And part of that figuring it out process entails a bit of trial and error. One day, Kevin came in from football practice. It was a hot afternoon. He took his shoulder pads off and realized he was wearing a white t-shirt underneath, and it was just drenched in sweat. He took the t-shirt off and put it on the scale, and it weighed 6 pounds. He thought, wow, if somehow I could have a shirt that didn't weigh me down, I could run a lot faster. I could actually be a better athletic performer. He wondered, would it be possible to craft or create a textile that would actually allow the air to breathe between his skin and outside his padding? Could it actually function as sort of an internal air conditioning system where it would cool him as the sweat would wick away? He decided to invest in 6 different fibers, took his last bit of money before he graduated from university, and it turned out one of those worked. It would allow the sweat to wick away from his skin, the air to breathe, cool the runner down a little bit, and in the process be lighter for what he's having to carry. That was the beginning of a company we call Under Armour. Kevin Plank started Under Armour as an undergraduate student in his senior year. He not only created a company that now employs thousands of people around the world, but he quite literally created an entire industry that we call performance apparel. That's the way in which you deploy creativity when facing a hinge moment. Each of us have been given certain gifts, talents, and abilities by God. And part of the challenge and opportunity for us is to be attentive to how God has uniquely wired us, how he has uniquely created us with skills and abilities that we could deploy to start a new venture, begin a new program, or craft a life for ourselves. Part of the creativity that we have to pursue in hinge moments is actually making something of the world. Entrepreneurs are people who create things out of nothing. They craft them. And each of us can be an entrepreneur of sort. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to start your own business, but it does mean we have to take responsibility for saying, unto him much is given, much is required, as we're told in Luke chapter 12. So that's one of the first practical lessons that I learned while doing this big study. It was a chance to see how one leader was able to apply creativity to make a positive difference for the wider world. A second insight that I learned came from a man whose family started a company in the hospitality industry. His name is Bill Marriott. Now, when you've got the last name Marriott, people recognize you literally around the world for hotels and resorts. Whenever I go to São Paulo, I will typically stay at a Renaissance hotel that's not very far from Mackenzie. That's one of the brands that's owned by Marriott. And so it was kind of fun to get a chance to sit down with Bill Marriott to hear a little bit about his own story and his own journey. His parents taught him at a very young age that he needed to embody what he called a bias for action. By this, he means you've got to have a natural proclivity, a natural leaning to say, I'm going to step into uncertainty and take action. I'm going to find ways in which we can make a positive difference. And he says it's that bias for action that's allowed him to take advantage of entrepreneurial opportunities that come along. So many of us are wanting to say, what's the sure deal? What's the guaranteed bet? But those don't exist in the real world. We oftentimes have to use judgment and discernment. That's why so much of the Bible is about teaching us how we learn lessons from Scripture that we can apply to make good decisions in uncertain futures. A bias for action basically says you're going to be inclined toward making a decision and trying things out. In Silicon Valley, they call this the process of failing early that allows you to fail forward. In other words, if you can make failure a regular part of your routine, it's a sort of a trial and error mechanism. I do not cook, and my wife who's here, she can attest to that. I don't have any skills in the kitchen, but I have learned that I can experiment by making pancakes with my daughters. And I just can throw all kinds of different things in those pancakes. And as long as it has sugar in it, they will love them. So I've learned that you just sort of test things out. We tried pancakes with gummy bears. It's kind of interesting. We've tried it with different kinds of cereal thrown in, fruit, a variety of sweets. There is this idea that you want to just sort of try things out. So often, you will find that when you're in university, you may be nervous about taking a risk, but actually it's a better time than any other point in your life to take a risk. The reason is because you've got lots of freedom, lots of possibility, and if you fail, if you make a mistake, it won't be catastrophic. Rarely are you the financial supporter for your whole family when you're 21 or 22. But when you're 41 or 42, you very well might be. It's a lot harder to take a risk in your 40s or 50s than it is in your 20s. And so Bill Marriott taught me that you have to be willing to sort of test things out and to demonstrate that bias for action. Sometimes that means taking a risk by moving to a place where you don't know a lot of people. Sometimes it means being willing to take a risk to start a new venture or to introduce yourself to someone. Very practical advice of a bias for action. At both Mackenzie and Taylor, every year we bring different leaders to campus to speak in classes, speak in chapel, and each of them have come because they love working with young people, because they love the chance to interact with promising, talented, aspiring leaders. So take the initiative to go and shake their hand, introduce yourself. You never know. It may actually be that they could offer you an internship or maybe even an opportunity to interview for a job. That's an example of how we demonstrate a bias for action. In addition to creativity and a bias for action, I learned over the course of my study, sometimes you have to embody what we call improvisation. I learned this from a very talented musician named Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice is a unusual woman because she has been accomplished in so many different fields. But oftentimes she made decisions and changes in her life because it was the most natural opportunity for her, but not one she had been planning or expecting. When she was growing up, she took years and years of piano lessons and actually became a very talented concert pianist. Everyone in her circle of friends and family had told her that that would probably be her career, that she would perform on some of the world's greatest stages as a concert pianist. She went one day as a 14-year-old to one of the largest global competitions for piano performance called the Van Cliburn Competition. It was held in Fort Worth, Texas, in the heart of the U.S. And while she was there, she had been standing backstage waiting to perform. This particular piece, she told me as we sat down in her office on the campus of Stanford, this particular piece, she had been practicing for over a year. She had exercised and worked on it multiple times, and it was going to be flawlessly executed. As she was sitting backstage, she recognized the beginning notes of the very song she had been preparing, but it was being performed by another competitor. It was a young man, not from nearby, and she said, I listened to him. I didn't watch him, I listened. And as I had my back turned to him and listened to this guy who was younger than I was, his execution was flawless. His musicality was perfect. Everything about his way of playing that piece was stronger and better than I was going to be able to do. She said, I realized in that moment, there is no way I can perform this as well as that guy did. After he completed the competition, he's standing backstage with her before she goes on stage. And she thought, you know, I have been working on this for a year. I wonder how long he's been working on it. So she got the courage to approach him and said, how long did you practice that particular piece? He said, oh, actually, I've been working on a different piece for many months, but decided about 3 weeks ago, I wanted to try something different. And so I picked it up. And he said, you know, I made a mistake or two, but I think it probably went okay. She said her heart sank when she heard that because she realized, I will never be as good as this guy who in a matter of 3 weeks was able to perform a piece better than I could after working on it for a full year. There will always be people who can do something better than you in different areas. Always. There will always be someone who can outrun you, always be someone who could program a software application better than you. There will always be someone who could sing a melody better than you. It's just part of the human condition. There's always going to be someone who will be better. But part of what we learn in Hinge Moments is how you take advantage of the unique giftings and abilities and be open to what God might do in your life. When Condoleezza Rice realized as a 14-year-old that she would never be as talented as that other performer, she said, it was an inflection point, a hinge moment where I realized I'm going to have to do something very different with my life. Because of that, she and her family talked about it and decided that she would apply to go to university at a much earlier age than usual. She graduated high school early and actually enrolled at the University of Denver as a 16-year-old. While there, she took a wide spectrum of classes because she was still exploring possibilities and decided that she wanted to take a class on the Soviet Union. It was taught by a venerable professor at the time named Professor Korbel. He had fled from Eastern Europe and settled in the United States and was really an expert not just on the Soviet Union, but really the Soviet system and communist Russia, as well as looking at dynamics on the Cold War from 1945 to 1985. She became fascinated with Professor Korbel and his passion for the Soviet Union, so much so that she decided she would study under him and decided to major in international relations. After she finished her undergraduate degree, she was so interested in it, she applied to do graduate work at Notre Dame University, and she pursued a master's degree and eventually a PhD. Through that, she ended up mastering the Russian language and became a real expert on the Soviet Union. The interesting thing about Professor Corbell is that he not only was a mentor to Condoleezza Rice, but he was also a mentor to another woman who served as the Secretary of State for the United States. This is the father of Madeleine Albright. So an extraordinary man who influenced two different women. And part of what made Condoleezza Rice such an effective leader is that she was willing to take that skill and ability that she had as a musician and apply it to her life. So often I'm amazed at folks who in our churches can improvise on the piano and they can sort of just somehow make the melody come alive. And oftentimes, if you go to more charismatic churches, those piano players are very talented because they have to be willing to sort of go with the flow. The pastor sometimes will decide to speak for 2 minutes or 20 minutes, and the piano player is just playing underneath. And they've got to be ready to pull out the hymn or the praise song that people are going to sing, and to be able to do that really well. That improvisation skill is something that Condoleezza Rice learned as a musician, but applied in her career, first as an academic and then as a policy leader. I had a chance to sit down with Dr. Rice after her time serving in the White House in Washington, D.C. You may remember she served as Secretary of the State as well as National Security Advisor for President George W. Bush. And when I sat down, I asked her about her most poignant moment of all those 8 years serving in Washington. I thought that she was going to tell me a story about being the National Security Advisor on September 11th. Or I thought she might talk about the day that she was sworn in as Secretary of State, the first African-American woman to hold that distinction. But instead, she said, I think probably the most impactful time of my entire 8 years in Washington occurred in June of 2002. Now, as she's telling me that, I'm thinking in my head, what happened in June of 2002? And she said, well, we were gathered in the Oval Office in what's called the Principals Meeting. This is a meeting of the President of the United States, his top 12 to 15 advisors. They gather in a circle, and it's an opportunity where they debate policy issues. This particular day, they were there to debate an initiative that was going to be a signature element of George W. Bush's foreign policy initiative. He had campaigned around a posture of what he called compassionate conservatism and really wanted to have a foreign policy that, at least in one way, that would demonstrate that sort of compassionate conservatism. At that time, the AIDS pandemic was just ravaging across sub-Saharan Africa. Quite literally, every single day, men and women were dying from AIDS in such large numbers that they were creating thousands of orphans across sub-Saharan Africa every day. It was a real problem. It was not a problem, though, in the West. In North America, South America, we had developed a series of drugs that people could take, pills that you would take, that was basically a version of chemotherapy. It did not heal you of AIDS, but it allowed you to be able to live with the disease. It was an expensive regimen that you had to go through, one that required particular time and energy and effort, but it had proven to be successful. The debate was whether the U.S. government ought to invest in the infrastructure to deliver the same kind of medicine across the African continent. The problem was that there was not the same public health infrastructure in Africa as there was in the U.S. And there was this concern that Africans may not be as focused on the timeliness of taking certain medicines, that the medicine does not work unless you take it in a certain routine in certain time sequences. But really, the key question was, would the U.S. government allocate $15 billion, which was the largest allocation of U.S. foreign aid in history? It was going to be 4 times the size of the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II. Would the U.S. government make that kind of commitment for something that is not seen as directly related to American foreign policy? As it turned out on that particular day, they're seated in a circle, and at the head of the circle on one side is President Bush, and right beside him was Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor. She said, I didn't always sit beside the president, but this particular day I happened to be there. She recounted to me the story of how they went around the room, starting beside the president, where each advisor sort of gave their interpretation of whether this was a good idea or not. By the time they reached her, the room was divided. Half of the people were in support of this agenda. Half of them thought it would be a bad idea. And then the president said, "Condi, what do you think?" She said, Mr. President, I understand the expense of what's involved here, and I understand the real challenges, concerns about the public health infrastructure and whether it would actually work. But she said, I want to tell you a little bit of my story. She said, the same year that I went to that Van Cliburn competition and learned that I was not going to be the piano performer I'd always dreamed of being, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. Because we were living near a medical community in Birmingham, my mom was able to get into an experimental treatment for breast cancer. And so mom entered into that routine. And as it turned out, it was successful. It did not cure her of breast cancer, but it allowed her to live. She survived the first year, then the second year, the third year. And actually, she was able to see me head off to university, develop a real interest in the Soviet Union, pursue a master's degree, earn a doctorate, and land my first teaching job on the campus of Stanford. Mom was with us for another 15 years after that initial diagnosis of breast cancer. And she said, I wouldn't trade those 15 years for anything. It was a hinge moment that she faced, that her family faced. And because of the generosity of others and medical care, her mom was able to live. Condoleezza Rice then turned to the president and said, Mr. President, we know that what we're considering will not cure these folks of AIDS, but it would allow them to get an extra 5, 10, maybe 15 years with their families, with their children. It would allow us to sort of stop the bleeding, so to speak, of the thousands of orphans that are being created across Africa. And she said, if we, the people in this room, have it within our power to keep an entire continent of children from becoming orphans, if we could do that, and we choose not to do that today, if we choose not to do that, I think history will judge this moment as our administration's greatest moral failure. She said after that, the room turned silent for about 1 minute, which she said is an eternity when you're in the Oval Office. We were all waiting to see what the president would do. He then looked up and said, well, I guess we know what we have to do. That day, they launched what is called PEPFAR. It is the most significant public policy achievement of George W. Bush's presidency. Liberals and conservatives alike have hailed it as a great public policy achievement. I had a chance personally to go and visit places like Zambia and Zimbabwe, which were in fact being ravaged by the AIDS pandemic. And because of the way in which PEPFAR made a difference, it created a whole different environment. It created an inflection point, a hinge moment, all because one woman mastered the skill of improvisation, felt a calling to go into international relations, and then when given the moment in the room where decisions are made, she was able to speak about her own journey of faith and the way in which you can make a difference, catalyzing entrepreneurial energy for the common good. That's the third key lesson that I learned over 10 years of interviewing these great leaders. Fourth key insight is the importance of both humility and confidence and how you hold those two things together. The picture of the man there on the left wearing the black suit, his name is Bernard Arnault. Most recently, he's been named the richest person in the world. He and his family own what is called LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy. It is a luxury goods conglomerate based in Paris that helps oversee a wide variety of luxury goods. And he's been a very successful business executive for a very long time. But one of the problems when you're in leadership is that oftentimes people will not tell you of the ways in which you're making mistakes or need to make a recalibration in judgment. Oftentimes you need people who are willing to speak confidently and directly, but also with humility. He got a chance to meet a man named Mike Ullman, who has become a dear friend and a mentor to me. Mike has an interesting story. He grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, did his undergraduate degree at the University of Cincinnati, where he was a mediocre student. But he had always been somebody who was willing to work hard. After a while, he ended up getting some opportunities to go into the retail business. And at a relatively young age, he was named the CEO of Macy's, the iconic retail company based in New York City. After that, he had a chance to move to Hong Kong, where he decided to create a whole new kind of business. It's what we now know today as duty-free shopping. Mike Ullman is the man who invented it. The idea is that if you could sell expensive luxury goods like perfume or chocolates, if you could sell those in transportation hubs where people were not going to be subject to paying local sales tax, it would be a way of actually selling those products to cost less to the consumer. And in the process of that, people would be more likely to buy. So he started it in Hong Kong, really at their airport, but it soon began to grow. And now, every time you travel internationally, you find duty-free shops, and they sell a whole variety of ideas. Well, they sold a number of the products that are produced by this luxury goods conglomerate, LVMH. And so because of that, Bernard Arnault in Paris began paying attention to what was happening in Hong Kong. Eventually, he invited Mike Ullman to come and join him in Paris at LVMH. It was an unprecedented move because that particular company had never had somebody outside of France come lead their enterprise. I asked Mike Ullman, why did Bernard Arnault, why did he hire you? And he said, because he wanted somebody who would be able to speak the truth to him. You see, oftentimes we are called to speak truth to power, and it requires a unique combination of personal humility. We're not trying to sort of make a name for ourselves, but also be willing to speak confidently about what is true and what's real. Having that unique combination of humility and confidence becomes a really significant way in which the Lord can use you to make a positive difference. Mike Ullman would say that that has changed his humility and confidence. So I found that there's people that you have to demonstrate a degree of creativity like Kevin Plank. You have to demonstrate a bias for action, a willingness to sort of take something and move forward like we saw with Bill Marriott. I saw the story of Condoleezza Rice and how she demonstrated improvisational skills that not only helped her own career trajectory, but actually made a difference on a global scale. And then the importance of humility and confidence that Mike Ullman demonstrated at LVMH. The fifth and final key element of how we can demonstrate and develop entrepreneurial leadership that serves the common good is a simple measure of focus. Drew Faust was the first woman to be named the president of Harvard University. Pat Gelsinger recently was named the CEO of Intel. Both of them, I had a chance to sit down and interview. And it's interesting because both of these individuals have sought to bring a degree of focus and intentionality to their organizations. Harvard is this iconic institution, most famous university in the world, celebrated recently its 375th anniversary. That's a really old institution. And Harvard, which is also the wealthiest institution of higher learning in the world, is a very decentralized kind of place. You have a school of education, a school of law, school of arts and sciences, a business school. All of them operate independently. All of them operate with their own endowments, their own resources, their own faculties. But Drew Faust had a vision for finding a way to bring them all under a larger umbrella, an initiative that she called One Harvard. She spent the entirety of her presidency, nearly a decade, trying to help unite these different sort of elements to say, how can we bring people together and create a greater synergy? Because oftentimes when we're trying to make a positive difference, we can become distracted or decentered. And actually what you got to do is continue to remain focused on the goal and objection. A real practical thing of what you can do is just write down your goals and put them on your bathroom mirror, or have them someplace that you see on a regular basis to remind yourself what you're trying to achieve. Pat Gelsinger is probably the most accomplished technology leader who's also a committed Christian. And he said one of the key things that he's trying to do at Intel is to help this global enterprise to be able to work together, to be able to solve some of the greatest problems. The development of silicon chips, which we use in everything from our computers to our telephones to the electronics that help make microphones and lights work. All of that is one of the key challenges in a global economy. And he said, what I've got to do is find a way in which we bring those different pieces together. That comes as a result of real focus. But over the course of my study, I found so many individuals who were willing to make a positive difference, but they had to be willing to say, I'm going to be focused on leaving a legacy of influence, making a very positive difference. One of those people that I met is a gentleman named Kien Pham. Kien Pham was originally from South Vietnam, and in the middle of the Vietnam War in the 1970s, as his city fell to the enemy, he and his family decided that they had to leave the country. They, along with tens of thousands of other South Vietnamese, took to a series of boats on the South China Sea. He actually was living on one of those boats in the South China Sea for months at a time. While he was there, he realized we're going to have to find a way to make a new life for ourselves, find a way in which we could get resettled. They applied for and were actually accepted into a refugee resettlement program that placed them in Boulder, Colorado in 1977. Now, he spoke no English at the time and really didn't know much about American society, but because Boulder is home to a major university, CU Boulder, he decided that he would listen to different lectures that would be conducted at the end of the day. So he would oftentimes go to those lectures just trying to work on his English skills to see if he could get them any better. One day, he heard a lecture by his local public official, a man named Tim Worth, who was serving as his representative in Congress. And while he was listening to Tim Worth, he recognized that Tim Worth was talking about a particular experience that he had serving as a White House Fellow, a program that had been started by President Johnson in 1965. Kien Pham didn't know much about it, but he went home, began to research the White House Fellowship, and decided he himself wanted to apply to see if he could become a White House Fellow. It's incredibly competitive. It's much more competitive than the Rhodes Scholarship. They'll have 3,000 or 4,000 people who will apply every year, and they'll choose usually 10 or 15 people. The idea is that you get a chance to work for 1 year in the office of the President of the United States or one of the cabinet secretaries. Working up close with them, you develop a lot of leadership skills, get a chance to see how you can make a positive difference through government. You take those skills back to wherever you came from, usually returning to your old job. And the idea is that it might prepare them for leadership down the road. Kien Pham applied for the White House Fellowship a few years later, but because it's so very competitive, he was rejected pretty quickly. But Kien Pham demonstrated an important skill for entrepreneurial leaders who want to make a difference in the world. He had resilience and grit and decided he would apply a second time. The second time he applied, he went a little bit further, had a chance to make it to the regional competition. So at this point, he was not just interviewing one-on-one, but in sort of a group interview, but then he was rejected. He decided to apply a third time. And that third time, he actually went all the way to the national competition. And by the hand of Providence, he was selected to be a White House Fellow. It's an amazing story. In 1977, he's floating around the South China Sea as a refugee. 8 years later, in 1985, he's shaking hands with the President of the United States in the White House and served as a White House Fellow for an entire year in President Reagan's administration. But after that, he began to say, how can I apply the lessons that I have learned over the course of my life to make a more positive difference? And he ended up saying, I want to make a positive difference back in my home country of Vietnam. He ended up putting together a group of investors to launch a telecommunications company in Vietnam. And still to this day, he's one of the most significant telecom investors in Vietnam and one of the most successful executives in his homeland. It was an amazing story. I'm sitting across the table interviewing Kiem Pham, and I said, how in the world did you end up getting drawn into this? And what is it that you decided to make a positive difference? Because I had learned that Kiem Pham actually had decided he was going to use his entrepreneurial leadership for something that would serve a much bigger cause. You see, in 1998, when he started his company in Vietnam, he realized that there were 400 political prisoners of war that had been held in captivity since 1977 at the end of the Vietnam War. Over 20 years, these political prisoners had been held. And he said, I wanted to figure out if there was a way that we could secure their release. He had stayed in touch with that congressman, Tim Wirth, who ended up being a mentor and a friend. And at this point in time, Tim Wirth was serving as Undersecretary of State. So we went to go see him. He said, I have an idea of how we might secure the release of some of these folks. Would you be willing to send a cable to the U.S. ambassador and ask him to go along with my idea? And let's see if we can make a difference to secure the release of a few of these prisoners. Sure enough, that happened. Kiem Pham began talking with some of his contacts there in Vietnam. And after a number of weeks, he secured the release of the first political prisoner who had been held in captivity for 22 years. It's an amazing story. He got the U.S. ambassador to hold a press conference. The ambassador praised the Vietnamese government for this magnanimous act of clemency, and then said, they were excited to see what might happen. A couple weeks later, Kiem Pham went back to his contacts there in the Vietnamese government and said, those Americans, they were pretty impressed with what you did. Why don't we try doing it a second time, release a second political prisoner, and see if that might actually open up some more doors of cooperation with the West. After a few weeks, they released a second political prisoner. And then it became a regular rhythm where every couple of weeks they would release a political prisoner. So much so that by late 1999, they gotten into a regular rhythm of releasing a political prisoner every other week. It was December of 1999 when Kiem Pham went to his contact there at the Vietnamese government and said, we've been dealing with this retail, let's try wholesale. He said, in many of the world religions, there is this idea that the millennial year, the year 2000, should be a year of jubilee, a year in which the prisoners are set free. Would you consider setting free all the remaining political prisoners that have been held in captivity since the end of the Vietnam War? They weren't sure they were going to do this, and there was a lot of negotiating back and forth with American officials and Vietnamese officials. But on December 31st, 1999, Kiem Pham secured the release of all the remaining political prisoners. It's an amazing story. A man who has been a successful entrepreneur who was willing to make a difference that also benefited the common good. I said, Kiem, why did you do it? What was it that was driving your commitment around this? He said, every night I floated around the South China Sea, I kept thinking about this one man. He said, I was interviewed on one of the morning talk shows here in the U.S. It's the Today Show. And they asked me, what was I thinking about the minute I shook hands with President Reagan in the Oval Office, being an immigrant who ended up becoming a White House fellow? I didn't tell him at the time, but really I was thinking about this one man. And he said, every single day that I went and worked on trying to secure the release of one of those political prisoners, I kept thinking about this one man. I said, Kiem, who was it? He said, it was my uncle, who is number 400 on that list and who walks as a free man today. Entrepreneurial leadership that works for the common good. That is both our calling and our opportunity as we begin this new year. Thank you very much.
We have several questions, both from Taylor University and Mackenzie for Dr. Lindsay. So I'll start with one and let's go from there. How should our Christian faith influence or impact our practice of entrepreneurship?
It's a great question. I'm really persuaded that one of the ways that we can demonstrate the difference of our Christian faith is not just how we go about our actions. Obviously, that we hope that Christians will be ethical in their business practices, that they'll demonstrate integrity and honesty in their business practices. But also, I think we have to think about entrepreneurial ventures that benefit not just ourselves, but benefit other people. I think one of the most profound ways that we can bear witness to our faith is when we're willing to sacrifice things that naturally people think we're entitled to. Maybe it's sacrificing a perk or a privilege like a parking spot at our company or a bonus that we might get at the end of the year. But there's an element in which we're willing to give things away, the way in which we're willing to give things up. I think that that's how we demonstrate entrepreneurship and making a very positive difference. So a sense of sacrifice, a sense of working for something that's bigger toward other people. Most entrepreneurs, they have to, early on, they're not taking a salary, they're investing whatever resources they have in the venture. But later on in life, when you become a more successful entrepreneur, it can be tempting to live a more luxurious lifestyle, drive a fancier car, live in a nicer house. But I interviewed dozens of entrepreneurs who have done the countercultural move to say, I'm willing to give things up to be a blessing to other people. I think one of the things we have to do is we have to say, we are blessed in order to be a blessing. I think that's a significant way that our entrepreneurial ventures can also demonstrate our Christian commitments.
Thank you. How can we think creatively in a seemingly more rigid profession?
Well, I think that lots of organizations can become sort of structures that it's hard to do new ventures or new opportunities. But I think that you can demonstrate creativity in the way you do your work and the way you relate to other people. And I'll give you maybe 2 or 3 very practical ideas. One is that I think that people of faith should be the most encouraging people around. So if you can cheer people on when they have success. Look for ways in which you can sort of tell them thank you or you appreciate them. I think that that can be a creative way in which you demonstrate something that's different. I also think that you can, as you're going about your work, whether you're the CEO or the most junior associate, I think you look for ways in which you can serve other people. So trying to find ways in which you take more of those service roles, that can be a creative move that I think can also cause people to ask questions, and oftentimes it can create opportunities for your career upward mobility. So I think creativity is largely a part about service and doing something that's countercultural.
Thank you. Here's a question. I have 1 more year before I graduate. Are there graduate programs at Taylor? If so, how do I apply?
Oh, I love that to my friends in Brazil. Yes, please come. We would love to have you. There are many opportunities, and we're actually launching a variety of additional graduate programs over the next year. So if you're interested, we hope you will check out our website. And if you want, you can send me an email. My email address is super easy. president@taylor.edu. So send me a message and we'll get you connected to the right people. We'd love to have some more folks from Mackenzie to come and join us. I hope when you come, you'll also bring my favorite dessert in the world, which is this amazing chocolate called Brigadeiro. I love it. So I hope you'll bring some when you come.
Thank you. How do I become aware of my own blind spots and improve my soft skills?
Get married. I find that our spouses can tell us our blind spots better than anybody else. So Rebecca knows all of my shortcomings, and she's not afraid to tell me about them. So I think it's really important to have good friends It can be a girlfriend or boyfriend, a fiance or a spouse, but it can also be your roommate or a best friend who can sort of speak into our life. One of the things I think is really important along the way is for you to have a chance to say, hey, I'm really interested in doing X or Y, and how do you feel that I'm doing in this particular area? I find that if you got a relationship, you have an opportunity to speak truth into somebody's life. And I think we have to use that as an opportunity to help each of us get better along the way.
Thank you. I am looking for an internship. What is the best way for me to prepare?
Almost every internship opportunity that comes your way comes through a relationship. It's very rare that you're going to land an internship, a good internship, without having some kind of relational connection. So when you're looking for a job or when you're looking to get started in the professional realm, you need to tell everyone you know that you're looking for something. So it's a matter of sharing with friends from church, people that were teachers or coaches or pastors or friends in your growing up years. Let them know that you're looking for something, because oftentimes they work in organizations or firms or have connections that can open up doors of opportunity. Also, I will say some of the best internships in the beginning are unpaid internships. So sometimes you have to do an internship where you're not making any money alongside another job where you are making money, but it's not really an internship. It's just helping to make ends meet. But in the process of doing both of those things together, I think that you'll find you'll get some good opportunities. So tell people that you're looking for a job and then actively try to pursue them. And I say, generally speaking, it takes 6 to 12 months to land an internship. Those are very hard to find early on. So start early and make those connections, and then I think it can open up doors of possibility for you.
Thank you. I'm still unsure which career path I should follow. How do I decide?
I think you have to follow the example of Condoleezza Rice, and you try a large set of things out. You just give yourself time to experiment. University is really great because you can take classes in lots of different fields. That's a very low risk way in which you get exposed to things. In addition to internships, they have these things called externships. An externship is basically job shadowing. So you ask somebody who's in a field you're interested in and say, hey, could I just come and see what you do on a regular basis? I bet every year I have a few people that shadow me for a day or two, get a chance to just see what is it like to be a university president. You can do that for a whole range of things. It might be a dentist, or it might be a business executive, or it might be a lawyer or a social worker. But just getting a chance to see how people interact and what their jobs look like become a really great way of trying things out. I also will say your first job out of university will never be your best job. So you just take whatever thing comes along the way. My first job after graduating college was as a software computer trainer. So I would work with mid-level managers to teach them basic end-using computing. I taught them things like Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Word, Microsoft PowerPoint. I knew virtually nothing about any of those things, but I was a decent communicator. I had some teaching experience, and the firm I went to work with was willing to teach me so I could teach my students. And I did that day in and day out. I basically was a teacher of adults, and I did that every single day for 3 years. At the end of every day of training, my students, it was a class of 12 to 15 people, would fill out an evaluation, and my compensation was tied to those evaluation scores. So I cared a lot about those evaluation scores. And it's amazing what a better teacher I became in those 3 years, because I mastered the art of learning. If my students could learn the material, they would leave feeling like it was a productive day, and they tended to give me higher evaluation scores. So I wanted that to be true for me, and so every day I got better and better. And most of the platform skills that I use in my job as Taylor's president, I learned in that first job out of college. And it had nothing to do with my major. It had nothing to do with where I had internships. It just happened to be the job I applied for and got. Oftentimes in God's providence, it's those kinds of opportunities that change our lives. And I think you have to just be open to the way in which God will lead you along the way.
Thank you. I'm shy, and I'm afraid that this personality trait will interfere with my work. What are the most valuable traits in the market nowadays? Will my shyness be a hindrance?
You know, I think that the world needs both introverts and extroverts. So I don't think that shyness is something to be afraid of. I think instead you find opportunities where you can demonstrate your skill. Oftentimes shy people are very good at keeping confidential information. And so they can serve in roles like legal, or they might be able to be good counselors, or they might be able to be people who can deal with company secrets, all kinds of things. So shyness could actually be your secret strength. It could actually be the very thing that helps you to move up in the world. Part of what you have to do is just create opportunities to play to your strengths. The example of Kevin Plank, he wasn't a star student. He wasn't a star athlete, but he was a creative thinker. He applied that creativity to experiment with 6 textiles, one of which ends up becoming the beginning of Under Armour. That's a great example of how just being creative, of saying, Lord, what are the things you've naturally gifted me to do, and how can I actually use those to find the right kind of career where I can make a positive difference? I think that's part of leveraging hinge moments to the most impact.
Thank you. What does it mean to be an entrepreneur in ministry?
An entrepreneur in ministry, well, I think anybody who's in ministry is an entrepreneur. You're about growing disciples, building up the church, winning people to come and know the Lord. And so there's entrepreneurship every single day. Oftentimes, people who are in ministry are very actively involved at starting things from nothing, creating opportunities. And so we want to really try and help leverage that. So whether you're at Mackenzie or at Taylor, we're hoping that you get the opportunity to really develop those kinds of skills and make a very positive difference. Maybe time for one more question, Dr. Edwards.
Okay, well then, does Taylor have scholarships and opportunities for exchange students?
We do have opportunities, and so if you're interested in learning more, we would love to have some Mackenzie students come here. We find Brazilians are the life of the party, so we want to have you here. And hope you will consider Taylor. It's been a real blessing to be with you all. To our friends in São Paulo and across Brazil, thank you so much for all that you're doing. We're grateful for our partnership. All of us here at Taylor, we love you guys. We look forward to more chances for partnership and are grateful for this chance we've had together. And we'll say goodbye now from Taylor. Thanks so much.
Muito obrigada, professor. Thank you, Professor Lindsay. Thank you very much. Your words were very inspiring. The stories you brought us were experiences. They brought us lots of lessons, and lessons that are very important for us, and talk about the need for us to be creative, improvise, to use our bias for action. You brought us so many ideas that really touch us, but more than everything, I think the main thing that you brought us at is the idea that we never know how far you can get. We know we can choose our next step, but we never know how far we can go, where we'll be in 5 or 10 years. So let's give ourselves a chance. Let's believe in ourselves. Thank you very much for being with us here, our directors, coordinators, professors, students. Thank you, all the students who have been with us remotely. And I want to invite you for the events we're going to have in the afternoon and the evening. In the afternoon, we are going to have Mateus, who is from Mackenzie and has created Moradigna, a social business for housing. He's going to talk about all his journey in this fantastic project. It's a really great project. Then we have Anderson Bars. He's a lawyer, and he's going to tell us how companies are looking at soft skills in their importance for professionals in Brazil. And we'll close that with questions and answers. And then we are going to talk a little bit more about the Max Teller program, the opportunities for you to develop your skills. And to close our event, in the evening, we'll have the fantastic architect Mariana Montag, who's going to talk about a housing project for women in Uganda and talk about her experience and how it affected her professional and personal development. Then we have Alberto Reutemann, a lawyer who graduated in Mackenzie. He's from Escola do Caos. And he's going to talk about the time he spent in university and how that has transformed his journey. In closing that night, we'll have Professor Cleverson Pereira showing academic opportunities regarding extension studies.
So we're going to have a lot of content, a lot of people coming in. And of course, everything is going to be available on our website. We'll be able to watch, rewatch, so and make the most of it, all right? I'll see you later. Thank you.